So I'm talking today with Associate Professor Brian Cook from the University of Melbourne, who is the lead researcher on Activity 6. Brian, could you start with giving us an overview of what is Activity 6?
Yeah. Activity 6 for me is the kind of fulcrum of the project. It's this point where the early activities 1 through 5, which are designed to get to know farmers and to find out what they want and to see their values, their interests, their fears, their aspirations, all of the things that kind of constitute their lives and what they think would be a good life, if that's activities 1 through 5. Activity 6 says, let's support them in the context that they want support. So if a farmer says, my life is a struggle because of the interest rates on my debt, then we would be looking at that expression of want and request for support and say, can we support them in that space? And so Activity 6 is where we have budgeted and have the opportunity to support farmers on the things that they look for. So Activity 7, obviously that comes after 6, is where we measure the impact. But if you imagine a project in its early stages, getting to know the context as deeply as possible and from as many vantages as possible. So we have quantitative analyses, we have qualitative analyses, we have group analyses, we have individual takes, we have relational analyses of a whole network that constitutes a farm and a farm livelihood. Those are activities 1 through 5. 6 says, what do these farmers want and can we help them directly? And that's my activity. And so that's where Activity 6 is exciting and stressful and you know, it's where I think the rubber hits the road for this project.
And so what phase is the activity at the moment?
Obviously, in those early activities, we're still running them, right? So we're still in the process of implementing Activity 3, having completed 2 and 1, and we're making the plans for 4 and 5. And because we're responsive to what farmers are asking for, Activity 6 has to kind of wait and watch and be part of all of those preceding activities to really get to know the farmers. And at the same time, I'm beginning to forge relationships with various actors in the region who provide support. So there would be NGOs who provide financial literacy. There are agricultural companies and NGOs and educational kind of institutions that provide advice on how to do no-till agriculture or do transition to fruit tree production or deal with pests and disease. So there's all these actors who work in the region to try and support farmers. And I guess in some ways, we do a bit of a matchmaking exercise as part of Activity 6. We say, these groups can help farmers. Farmers want help on those topics. Can we bring them together? And the thing I guess that's quite interesting for us is because development more generally has transitioned to a cost recovery model in most instances, we're in a state where support for farmers, or there's a belief that farmers should pay for it. And our project kind of says, well, they're already impoverished, they're already very close or below poverty line levels. If we remove that cost and we provide the support and bear the burden of that cost, perhaps that will free the farmers to be able to implement it and follow through and really reap the rewards of that support. Where do we stand at the moment for Activity 6? It's about understanding what those farmers are asking for and would most benefit from, and identifying where there's pre-existing groups trying to work on that, and perhaps being open to us having to provide some form of support or subsidy or something in response to what farmers have asked for. Additionally, I guess, Activity 6 is currently in a kind of conceptual phase. One of the most challenging, I guess, or exciting parts of Activity 6 is that we want to broaden what counts or what contributes to a good life or a successful life. And so historically, in order to judge the impact of support for farmers, we tend to revert to agricultural production, like whether yields have gone up, whether productivity has gone up, and closely related to that, some sort of profit, gross margin, or some sort of livelihood analysis pushing into hard economics. So do you have more money at the end of the year than you would have as a result of the intervention? And that's really valuable. No one would say that that isn't a useful way of assessing, but we know, and economists and agricultural economists for eons have argued that we also need to account for what has historically been called intangible, or that we have a difficult time accounting for. And, you know, just off my head here, happiness is one that I think is really, really important. So if a particular support also has the benefit of raising levels of happiness or life fulfillment, or the peace of mind that comes with knowing that your children are likely to have opportunities for a better life, if the support being provided adds in that way to a household, our project says we need to count that. We need to include that in our assessments of the impact that different interventions have. So it could be that, let's take a classic like mechanization, for example. It could be that mechanization raises productivity substantially on a farm, but it could also, with that, raise debt levels and borrowing and risk and stress to a degree that the farmer's really unhappy and perhaps depressed or just in an awful state. And so I think what we want to do is include that sort of broadened scope to be able to assess different pathways through different actors who are providing support to farmers. Raising their productivity, if it comes at the cost of them having a heart attack or suffering from significant depression, needs to be something that we consider when we're comparing different ways of supporting farmers. And so for us, coming back to your question of what Activity 6 is doing, we need to conceptualize that. And there's a rapidly growing discourse in the academic literature about learning, about impact assessment, about broadening the metrics and the scopes of what can be measured, how you measure it, what units you use to measure those types of things. And that's very much where Activity 6 is spending a lot of its time.
So what have you learned from the project over the last 12 months, which is influencing Activity 6?
Yeah, a lot, I guess is the short answer. I've been so impressed. Like, it's an amazing team. And so Activity 1 has really, I think, opened up how experts understand and think about agrarian change, rural development, agricultural extension, which is, you know, our purpose. And Activity 2, the scale of our engagement, the census of engaging with all these households in these villages at, you know, upwards of 3,000 households, gives us a view that is really rare. And so I think where I see the project heading and how I'm learning as the project proceeds is that this project really walks the research for development ethos that our funder has. And so it's really hard for researchers to produce knowledge and lessons and outputs and things that have direct impacts in practice. And this is a long-standing challenge that all sorts of researchers in all sorts of sectors have. But in the agricultural and agrarian change context, research for development is this idea that says, you know, direct pathways from your research into the development space, so that we're not just creating ivory tower reports that sit on shelves and maybe indirectly influence a sector way down the road in some kind of really, really hard to determine manner, but that we have as direct a link between the research and practice as possible. And so I think what was quite bold by the funders of this project is they said, all right, we will allow budgeting to fund those direct interventions or support for farmers. So the Activity 6 is like the 4 in the research for development, right? So we're doing all this research, we're getting to know, and then Activity 6 says, we'll fund the support and development kind of support and measure the impact of that. And I suppose the argument that we would make is that by broadening the scope of measuring impact and by implementing a number of support interventions that are very different, enables us to compare support pathways that typically get done in isolation. So I think what I'm learning is both why this isn't normally done, because it's really, really hard to kind of organize and pull that off. It's the thing that keeps me up at night when I'm worrying about how we're going to pull this all together. But I can see the research side of this coming together. I'm having engagement with the development sector in the region and the actors who are trying to support farmers, and I can see the four linking those two components. And I know through Nick's work in Activity 7 that we're broadening the scope for impact analysis to make sure that we're capturing both those kind of classic economic impacts as well as a broadened suite of impacts that come through development assistance and development support. So that's what I'm learning, I guess, yeah.
And what's planned for the next 12 months for Activity 6?
Yeah. So it's very much what I was just describing. We need to complete the conceptual work. We need to go through the literature and highlight all the various ways that people can think about how you help someone and how you measure the impact of that help with farmers or support. And that's where we are. And there's some amazing work coming out at the moment. You could very easily say that the sector has begun to emphasize impact. And that, that cuts both ways. There's the random control trial kind of scientific, really quant technical push in that. But I think also there's in addition to that, a group that says, no, let's also broaden it to happiness, well-being, fulfillment, and risk, and all these kind of classically intangible or difficult to measure aspects. So I think in general, the push towards measuring impact is a good thing that we're working on over the next 12 months. So, we're going to finish the 1 through 5 activities, the getting to know, the identification, and at the same time, reconceptualize or conceptualize how we're understanding support for farmers and the analytic that we'll use to measure that. And that's where the next, not 12 months. I got to get that done quicker than 12 months. That'll be in the next month or two.
And what are you hoping to find out?
In the most simple way, I hope that we can determine what works. And so the development sector has long understood that these are endemic, complex challenges that don't have answers. And so we're not going to be like, here's the silver bullet, here's the way to eliminate poverty and make the world a great place for farmers. Like, our society and the world is a mess in many respects. So for us, when we say what works, I think what we can point to is that there are an awful lot of groups and organizations trying to support farmers, doing in different ways and using different philosophies and measuring their impact in different ways. And that's great. I think diversity is a benefit. We should be looking at something as important as poverty, inequity, and inequality with multiple lenses, with multiple kind of ways of thinking about it. But for us, in this moment, for these farmers in Northwest Cambodia, we know there's a host of groups out there helping or trying to help them, and we have very little comparative understanding of what is helpful in what terms. And so I think really simply it's like, all right, we've got all these different activities trying to help farmers. Let's participate in that. Let's support that. Let's look at that. And let's also broaden how we understand its impact. And if we get to the end of the project and we're able to say that this sort of support is beneficial to this type of farmer in this kind of context, and really nuance that, say that same support might not benefit a different farmer with different circumstances, but this other kind of support does help them or doesn't help them, or it actually makes things worse. If we say what works and then you drill down deeply into that so that you can say to these organizations who are trying to help farmers, this pathway seems to work best with this group of farmers in this way. And obviously that will be just one step along a long development journey, but I'm hopeful that the ability to kind of be more tailored towards the life and the experiences of those farmers, their aspirations and needs, would make the hard work that the development sector does maybe a little more efficient, a little more effective, and also, I hope, and it's my deep-seated suspicion, is that there's a lot of benefits currently being done for farmers that don't get captured or don't get accounted for in the ways we typically understand development. And I would hope that by doing this sort of work, we can show a rigorous way of capturing those impacts so that we can also not necessarily pat the development sector on the back. It has all sorts of problems too, but there are goods arising from all sorts of activities and perhaps bads that don't get counted. And I think a better understanding of that is really valuable.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thanks so much.